They say every forgotten place hides a story. But what would you do if one winter night your loyal dog led you to an abandoned barn glowing with a faint light, and inside you found an old man, injured cold and unable to remember his own past? This was the moment that pulled veteran Jake Walker into a mystery surrounding an old woodworking shop, a lost legacy, and a town waiting to heal. Stay with us and enjoy this heartfelt journey of hope, renewal, and community. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The winter night settled over the mountain town with a quiet weight, the sky covered in thick clouds that held the cold like a promise. Snow pushed against every cabin wall and filled the roads with drifts that shone faintly under the dim street lamps. Wind moved through the pine trees with a slow, mournful sound, as if the forest itself remembered every difficult season it had endured before. The air carried the scent of ice and old wood and the harsh calm that only deep winter could create. In this silence, a man walked alone toward a small cabin at the edge of the ridge. Jake Walker was 40 years old and moved with the deliberate strength of someone who had once carried more weight on his shoulders than any human should. Years of service overseas had shaped him into a lean and angular man whose muscles worked with quiet precision. His face bore sharp lines cut by time and hardship, his jaw strong and usually covered in a short, dark beard that blended with streaks of gray at the sides. His eyes were a deep blue gray that rarely showed more than a guarded calm. Those who saw him around town noticed how he kept his voice low and polite but distant. There had been an explosion during his last deployment that took two friends he loved like brothers. Since then, something in him held tight to silence, as if releasing it would reopen old wounds. Jake never spoke about the war. He never explained the nightmares that woke him before dawn. He accepted whatever work he could find, mostly hauling lumber or unloading supplies at the local depot. His clothes were worn flannel shirts, heavy boots, and a coat patched more than once. Nothing about him was careless, but nothing was soft either. He looked like a man built to endure rather than complain. Beside him moved a German shepherd named Max. Max was 6 years old, with a thick sable coat that shifted between bronze and dark black depending on the light. His ears stood tall and attentive, and his amber eyes held the alert intelligence of a dog trained to read danger before any human could sense it. Max had served with Jake in the same unit, trained to detect threats and guide soldiers through chaos. When the war ended and Jake returned home broken in ways he refused to name, Max returned with him. People often said the two shared the same quiet expression, steady and cautious, yet filled with a loyalty that never faltered. Max rarely left Jake's side. In town, he walked closely by his leg, reading the world through scent and sound. At home, he slept by the cabin door, as if keeping guard against the things Jake would not speak of. Jake lived on the outskirts of the mountain town in a small wooden cabin that had belonged to his father. The boards were old and warped from years of storms. The roof groaned under heavy snow every winter. Inside, the walls were bare, except for a few tools and a cot. Jake was not a man who needed much. He spent his evenings repairing small things around the cabin, or sitting by the fire with Max resting at his feet. What he felt inside was harder to name. There were days he woke with a hollow ache in his chest that nothing could fill. The work helped. The routine helped. Max helped most of all. But still, there was a weight that lingered like winter fog at the edge of his thoughts. On this night, the storm worsened. Wind pushed against the cabin windows with a dull thud, and snow blew sideways in thick sheets. Jake stepped outside to gather more firewood. Max followed with a low rumble in his chest, not fear, but awareness of the shifting weather. As Jake lifted the woodpile cover, he noticed something unusual on the distant hillside. Through blowing snow, a faint glow flickered like a candle behind a layer of frost. He narrowed his eyes, unsure at first if it was simply a trick of the storm. That part of the ridge held only abandoned structures left from the early timber days. The largest was an old storage barn, long believed to be unsafe. Locals avoided it, and Jake had never given it much thought. Yet now, an unmistakable thread of light pulsed through one cracked window. Something tightened in his chest. He did not believe in omens, but he knew the mountains well enough to understand that no one should be wandering around such a structure in this weather. Max lifted his head, ears shifting forward, eyes locked on the same direction. A soft growl sounded from his throat as he leaned closer to Jake, signaling that he sensed something unfamiliar. Jake stood motionless for a moment. The wind stung his face and whipped snow across his boots. He weighed the choice in silence. The storm was dangerous, and the barn had a reputation for collapsing beams and rotted floors. But the faint light held steady. Someone might be in trouble. And Jake Walker was not the kind of man who turned away from danger if another life was at risk. Service had carved that instinct too deeply into him. He whispered to Max in a steady voice, "Stay close." The dog pressed against his leg in agreement. They set off across the snow-covered path, their steps slow and deliberate. The air burned cold against Jake's lungs as he climbed toward the hillside. Max moved ahead a few feet, then returned to Jake's side as if guiding him through unseen currents in the wind. The closer they came, the more visible the flicker became, painting thin rays of light across the drifting snow. Jake's mind churned with steady focus as he walked. He remembered nights overseas when the only light in the darkness had come from fires burning in shattered buildings or from lost soldiers using weak signals for help. His heart thrummed with the same quiet tension he had felt back then. He wondered if he was ready to face whatever waited inside that barn. But he kept going. Max kept going. They had survived worse than a winter storm and a forgotten building. When they reached the lower edge of the hill, Jake paused to examine the structure. The barn was large but sagging under decades of neglect. Wooden planks bowed outward. The roof had lost several shingles and leaned slightly to the left. Frost clung to every surface like a second skin. Yet behind one of the boarded windows, a thin orange glow flickered again. It was faint, but unmistakably real. Jake felt a shift inside him, something between caution and resolve. He approached slowly, Max moving in a tight circle as if mapping the area. Snow muffled every sound until Jake could hear only his own breath and the faint crackle of ice under Max's paws. He reached the wide door, pushed lightly, and found it locked by a rusted chain. He tested the wood instead and felt it give beneath his hand. The barn had grown weak from years of storms. With a careful shove, he pushed open a narrow gap wide enough to step through. Max entered first, his body tense but steady, nose raised to read the air. Jake followed and stood still as his eyes adjusted to the dim space. The smell of old hay and damp timber filled the room. Shadows layered over broken equipment and fallen boards. In the far corner, he saw the source of the light. A small lantern lay tipped on its side, still glowing, though its flame sputtered. Next to it was a cluster of footprints leading deeper into the barn. They looked recent and uneven, as if whoever made them had been struggling to stand. Jake felt the familiar surge of alertness that had once guided him through enemy territory. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. He stepped toward the lantern, picked it up, and held it steady. Max stayed at his heel, muscles taut, ready to respond the moment Jake needed him. As Jake studied the footprints, he sensed the path of the story unfolding before him. A quiet man who had tried to live with his pain. A loyal dog who refused to leave his side. A storm that hid more than snow. And now, a single flickering light in a forgotten barn that called him back into a world where he might once again be needed. He took a slow breath, feeling the cold air ground him. Then he stepped deeper into the barn, with Max guiding the way, unaware that this night would change both their lives and pull them out of the shadows they had carried for far too long. The storm thickened as the night deepened, and the wind pressed against the walls of the old barn like a slow, relentless drumbeat. Snow moved across the open fields in heavy waves, turning every shape into a pale blur. The air inside the barn carried a sharp cold that clung to breath and skin, filling the vast dark space with a stillness that felt older than the building itself. The dim lantern that Jake had lifted cast a trembling pool of light along the rotted beams. Dust floated like faint smoke, and the scent of frost and damp wood cut through the silence. Jake stepped forward with careful strides, his boots sinking slightly into the old hay scattered across the floor. Max stayed close, his body low, his ears fixed on every corner of the barn. The dog moved with the controlled tension of an experienced guardian, shifting his weight as if ready to react to any sudden change in the air. Jake felt the familiar sense of alertness taking hold in his chest, the same vigilant calm that had kept him alive in worse places than this. Yet this barn felt different. The quiet was too heavy. The lantern light flickered as if disturbed by something unseen. As Jake and Max approached the back of the barn, the faint outline of a collapsed workbench appeared. Beside it lay a huddled shape barely visible beneath a torn wool blanket. Jake felt his breath tighten. Max halted, his body stiffening, then moved forward with a slow, steady pace. Jake followed and lifted the lantern higher. The flickering glow revealed an old man collapsed against the wall, his body curled inward as if trying to shield himself from the cold. His clothes were soaked with melting snow. His hands trembled violently. His skin was pale and dry, marked by deep wrinkles carved from years of labor and harsh winters. He appeared to be near 70, though exhaustion made him seem older. Strands of white hair clung to his forehead. His thin beard was uneven and mostly gray, and his lips were cracked from the freezing air. Jake knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. A weak pulse fluttered beneath the cold skin. The old man's eyes opened slightly, showing faded blue irises clouded with confusion. His gaze drifted without focus, as if he were looking through Jake rather than at him. He attempted to speak, but only managed a broken whisper that dissolved into the cold air. Jake recognized the signs of hypothermia and exhaustion, conditions that could steal memory and reason as easily as life itself. Jake spoke in a calm and steady tone, though his voice stayed low. He knew from experience that panic would only worsen the man's fragile state. Jake slid his arm beneath the man's shoulders and felt the frail weight of a body pushed too far. The man winced in pain. Jake could feel how thin he was, how his bones pressed sharply beneath his clothes, how hunger and cold had taken their toll long before this storm. Max circled them slowly, sniffing the ground, then returned to Jake's side. The dog's amber eyes held a deep focused concern. He leaned his head close to the old man's chest, inhaled, then stepped back with a faint growl rumbling through him. Jake understood that sound. Max was not sensing aggression, but something unknown, something that clung to the old man like a scent of danger carried from another place. It made Jake even more determined to get him out of the cold. Jake wrapped the man's upper body with the torn blanket and lifted him with steady strength. The old man groaned, but did not resist. His arms hung limp, and his head rested against Jake's chest. Max moved ahead to guide them toward the broken doorway they had entered. The barn seemed colder now, as if recognizing one of its occupants was being taken away. Wind pushed through the cracks in the boards, scattering dust across the lantern light. Outside, the storm wrapped around them instantly, pressing sharp flakes of snow against Jake's coat. Max stayed so close that his fur brushed Jake's leg with every step. Visibility dropped to only a few yards, and the path back to the cabin blurred under the shifting snow. Jake lowered his head and moved through the storm with deliberate effort, each breath burning in his chest. The old man's shivering lessened, but Jake knew that was not a good sign. Extreme cold often numbed the body before it crushed it. He tightened his grip and pushed forward. When they reached the cabin, Jake kicked the snow from his boots and pushed the door open with his shoulder. Warmth washed over them from the dying fire inside, and the sudden shift in temperature made the old man's body convulse weakly. Jake carried him to the cot and set him down with care, adjusting the blankets around his trembling frame. Max stood at the door for a moment, listening to the storm outside, then lay down near the cot with his head raised and ears pricked. Jake removed the old man's soaked coat and placed it near the hearth to dry. He set another log on the fire and felt the heat slowly fill the room. Then he wrapped an extra quilt around the old man and rubbed his arms to stimulate warmth. The man stirred slightly and opened his eyes again. His gaze wandered across the room without recognition. His breath was uneven, shallow at times, then deep as if searching for lost memory. Jake watched the confusion in his eyes and felt a quiet ache. He knew what it meant to be lost inside one's own mind, even for a moment. Trauma could steal clarity as easily as cold could steal life. Jake prepared a small cup of warm water and helped the man sip a little. The man winced, but swallowed a few drops. His voice rasped something unintelligible, barely more than a tremor in the air. Jake steadied him and spoke calmly, telling him to rest, that he was safe, that the storm would soon pass. The old man's gaze drifted to Max. The dog sat perfectly still, watching him with unblinking intensity. Something in the man's expression flickered, a faint trace of fear or memory, but the meaning dissolved before it could form. He closed his eyes again and sank into a state between sleep and exhaustion. Jake sat in a wooden chair beside the cot and rested his forearms on his knees. His thoughts moved in heavy circles. He had little food and little space. He barely made enough money to support himself and Max. Taking in another person, even for one night, meant stretching resources already thin. Yet the idea of leaving the old man to the storm was unthinkable. Jake had seen too many people abandoned when they needed help the most. He refused to repeat that world here. Max shifted, rising to his feet with a quiet huff. He walked to the door, sniffed the bottom edge, then returned to the cot. His eyes remained sharp and alert. Jake recognized the behavior. Max sensed something lingering about the old man, a scent from somewhere dangerous or troubled. The dog stayed near the cot, but kept his body ready, muscles taut, breath steady. Jake leaned back and studied the stranger sleeping beneath his blankets. The man had deep lines across his brow that hinted at years of labor or worry. His hands were rough and calloused, marked by scars that suggested he had once worked with tools or heavy equipment. His beard was uneven, as if he had not groomed himself in days. Everything about him suggested someone who had carried burdens alone for far too long. Jake understood that kind of loneliness. The fire crackled quietly. The storm roared outside, like a distant memory, trying to claw its way in. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling over him. He would care for this man until he recovered. He would give him warmth and food and a chance to regain his strength. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he had no choice. But somewhere beneath those thoughts, he felt the familiar pull of duty, the instinct to protect the vulnerable even when he himself was barely standing. Max lay down again with his head on his paws, but his eyes never left the old man. The dog breathed slowly, reading every shift in the stranger's scent and every tremor of his frail body. Jake knew Max would not sleep tonight. He would keep watch until morning because that was who he was. A guardian forged by war, loyal beyond reason. The storm outside intensified, and snow scratched against the window like cold fingers seeking entry. Inside the small cabin, the fire glowed warm against the logs. Jake sat in silence beside the cot, his thoughts heavy but steady, his breath slow, as he prepared himself for whatever the morning revealed. He glanced at Max and felt a quiet reassurance. They had survived darkness before. They would face whatever came next together. The old man trembled once more beneath the blankets, then grew still as exhaustion settled deeper into his bones. Jake watched him with a calm, determined gaze. This night, he had saved a life. Tomorrow, he would try to understand the mystery behind the old man's presence in the barn. But for now, there was only the storm, the fire, and the steady vigilance of a man and his dog keeping danger at bay. Morning arrived with a pale, washed light that softened the sharp edges of winter. The storm had weakened into a slow drift of snow that fell quietly from the gray sky. Cold mist clung to the tops of the pine trees and wrapped the mountain town in a muted haze. In the small cabin, Jake stirred from a restless night as the fire in the hearth glowed faintly, still alive beneath the ashes. Max lay near the cot where the old man slept. The dog had not closed his eyes for long, and his posture held a steady vigilance, as if he sensed the cabin carried a new tension. Jake rubbed his face and drew a long breath. He felt the weight of responsibility sitting firmly on his chest. The stranger had survived the night, yet the silence surrounding him felt fragile and uncertain. The old man shifted beneath the blankets. His breathing steadied, though a faint tremor still moved across his hands. Jake approached and knelt beside him, watching as awareness slowly returned to the man's eyes. The man blinked a few times, his faded blue irises struggling to focus as if the world drifted in and out of shape. The confusion in his gaze eased slightly, and he lifted one hand to his forehead. His fingers brushed across his temple as if searching for a misplaced thought. The old man's appearance remained haggard and frail. His face was lined deeply, as though carved by years of sorrow and hard work. His hair was thin and white, falling in uneven strands across his brow. His beard was patchy and gray, framing a jaw that once looked strong, but had weakened over time. The skin on his hands showed the rough texture of someone who had spent decades working with tools. Scars stretched across his knuckles and the base of his fingers, marks often seen on craftsmen who had shaped wood day after day. Though his body appeared worn, there was a certain quiet strength in the way he held himself now that he was awake, as if some buried part of him refused to yield completely to age and illness. Jake sat beside him in silence, patient and steady. He noticed the old man's eyes search the room with small, hesitant movements. Finally, the man's gaze met his, and something shifted in the depth of his expression. Recognition did not form fully, but a fragile thread of memory began to weave itself together. Jake spoke slowly and calmly, keeping his tone gentle. He explained that he found the man in the abandoned barn during the storm and brought him here for warmth. As the old man listened, a subtle tremor crossed his lips. He pressed his hand to his chest as though each word stirred something inside. After a long pause, the man whispered a name: Howard Miller. The sound came out weak and strained, but clear enough. Jake felt the name settle heavily into the quiet cabin. Howard Miller. It was a name that carried weight in the town's older stories. Jake remembered hearing mentions of a skilled woodworker who once owned one of the busiest carpentry shops in the region. The stories had faded over the years as the shop fell silent, and Jake never learned the details. But now he realized he was looking at the man behind those old tales. Howard blinked slowly and continued speaking, though his voice dragged like someone pulling memories from deep water. He explained that he had once run a successful woodworking shop at the edge of town. It specialized in handmade furniture, wooden beams, and custom pieces that supported half the valley. He described himself in his younger days as a broad-shouldered man with steady hands and a disciplined spirit. Through the years, he became known not only for his craftsmanship, but for his patience and integrity. He had trained apprentices, helped neighbors, and lived a life devoted to his craft. Then his voice tightened. Jake watched as Howard's expression changed, the muscles around his mouth tightening as if old wounds pushed to the surface. Howard spoke about his son, a young man who had inherited his talent and dreamed of taking the shop even further. But an accident claimed his life, leaving Howard alone and overcome with grief. After that day, the workshop grew silent. Howard could not bring himself to open its doors again. Dust settled on the tools. Wood warped and cracked. The building became little more than a memory fading into the landscape. Howard paused and pressed his hand against his forehead as though the weight of sorrow still lived there. His voice steadied enough to reveal another truth. The workshop still held something important, something he believed he needed to recover. He could not explain precisely what it was, only that he had returned to the workshop recently, and that fear had stopped him from retrieving it. The details blurred again in his mind, and frustration flickered through his expression. Jake saw a man wrestling with fragments of memory, each piece sharp, yet incomplete. Max lifted his head from the floor. His ears pricked sharply. The dog stood and walked toward the old coat Jake had placed near the fire the night before. Max sniffed it with a focused intensity, his nose moving along the worn fabric and embroidered seams. He lowered his head, then jerked back slightly, as if a scent had startled him. A faint growl rose from his chest. It was not loud, but it carried a message Jake recognized. Max had found something on the coat, something that did not belong to Howard alone. Jake walked to Max and examined the coat closely. He noticed small patches of dirt that did not match the soil near the barn. There was also a faint metallic smell mixed with a scent of old varnish and dried resin. It reminded Jake of a woodshop floor, but layered beneath it was something different. A smell that hinted at another person who had been near Howard before Jake found him. A stranger's presence clung to the fabric. Max caught the scent clearly, and his reaction confirmed it. Inside Jake's mind, the pieces began to shift. Howard had gone to the workshop searching for something meaningful. He had encountered fear. His memory was fragmented. And now, Max had confirmed the presence of someone else in that place. Jake felt a quiet chill settle in his chest. He had no evidence beyond a scent and a broken memory, but he trusted Max. The dog did not sense danger without reason. Howard leaned back against the pillows, breathing slowly as exhaustion pulled at him again. Jake studied him carefully. The man looked smaller now, as if the weight of past grief and present fear pressed heavily across his shoulders. Jake understood that burden too well. He felt something inside himself stir, a familiar pull toward duty. He had taken Howard into his cabin out of necessity, but he felt the deeper instinct growing. Howard was not simply a stranger in need of warmth. There was a story unfolding around him that Jake could not ignore. Max returned to Howard's side and sat close, watching him with protective caution. Jake saw the way the old man looked at Max, a flicker of trust forming slowly in his eyes. Jake understood that look. It was the expression of someone who recognized loyalty even in his fractured state. Jake reached for another blanket and placed it over Howard's legs. The man nodded slightly, acknowledging the gesture. Outside the cabin, the snow drifted softly across the silent landscape. The storm had passed, but the air remained cold and still. Inside the cabin, the fire brightened as a fresh log caught flame. Howard closed his eyes as though gathering his strength. Jake sat quietly beside him. The sense of mystery deepened as he pieced together what little he knew. Howard's fear, the abandoned workshop, the lingering scent of someone who should not have been there. The puzzle held no clear edges yet, but Jake felt certain of one truth. Whatever waited in that workshop was not just a memory for Howard. It was a secret tangled with danger. Max shifted again and placed his paw against the wooden floor as if marking something unseen. Jake understood. The dog had made his judgment. Someone else had been in the workshop. Someone who did not belong. The chapter closed in Jake's mind with a single clear thought. Howard Miller's past was no longer just his own. It had already reached into Jake's life with cold fingers, and the path forward would demand answers that could only come from the workshop itself. Morning light settled across the mountain town in a muted layer of pale silver. The storm from the previous days had eased, leaving behind a quiet stillness that wrapped the trees and narrow roads like a fragile blanket. Thin clouds drifted above the ridge, and sunlight pushed through in faint streaks. The cold air carried the crisp scent of frozen pine and damp soil. Frost glittered across the edges of the old paths as Jake prepared for the walk toward the abandoned workshop. Max stood at his side with alert posture and steady breath, ready for whatever waited ahead. Jake stepped outside the cabin with a lingering weight in his chest. The memories from the night before played heavily on his mind. Howard Miller still rested in the cabin, weak and exhausted from cold and confusion. But the pieces of his story that managed to surface had stirred something urgent in Jake. The workshop held the key to understanding what had happened to the old man. More importantly, it held something that Howard believed was worth returning to despite his fear. Jake felt the pull of responsibility settle deeper. He could not walk away now. After all, he had spent years in service learning that abandonment of duty was never an option. Max walked slightly ahead, placing his paws into the snow with precision. His tail remained low but steady, his head angled forward as he tested the air for scents carried from the direction of the workshop. The dog had sensed another presence around Howard. Jake trusted that instinct fully. Max had never once given a false warning. Jake felt both gratitude and unease. Danger had a way of returning when least expected. As they moved toward the workshop, the landscape grew older in appearance. Bent fence posts stood half buried in snow. Patches of dead grass poked through the white surface. The earth felt neglected, as if the place itself waited for someone to remember it. Jake approached the structure with cautious strides. The workshop sat at the edge of the woods, its walls warped and the paint peeled from long seasons of harsh weather. The roof sagged slightly on one side. Broken planks formed gaps where cold air drifted freely through the building. The wide door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Jake paused at the entrance and studied the patterns in the snow. Footprints from the storm had mostly filled in, but a few faint depressions remained. They did not belong to him or Max. They were irregular, shallow tracks made by more than one person. The sight made Jake's jaw tighten. He felt a stirring of tension that sharpened his senses. Max lowered his head and sniffed the ground, then moved toward the door with deliberate steps. His ears pricked forward with clear alertness. Jake pushed the door open. It groaned loudly against the hinges. Inside the workshop, the air felt thicker and colder than outside. Dust drifted through the faint beams of morning light that cut through the gaps in the walls. Tools lay scattered across workbenches as if time had frozen mid-task. Wooden boards, once carefully shaped, now lay warped with moisture. The scent of old varnish and sawdust lingered. Jake moved carefully across the floor, his boots pressing quietly against the aged wood. Max explored ahead, weaving between fallen planks and broken furniture. The dog paused near a long crack in the floor and sniffed with deep concentration. His fur lifted slightly along his spine. Jake followed and studied the area. He saw fresh scrapes along the edges of the cracked boards. Someone had recently disturbed them. His heart beat steadily as the truth began forming in his mind. Howard had not been alone in this workshop. Someone had followed him or found him here, and that someone had reason to hide their presence. Jake stepped further into the workshop, studying every shadow. He felt the familiar instinct of danger rise through him. It was not the tense shock of battle, but the slow, deliberate sense that something had been set in motion long before he arrived. As he moved toward the center of the room, the floor beneath him shifted. It happened so quickly, he had barely a moment to react. The wood buckled beneath his boot. A sharp crack tore through the air. Jake's weight dropped as the floor gave way. Max barked with sudden force and lunged forward. Jake felt the board split and collapse beneath him. He grabbed for the edge, fingers scraping against splintered wood. For a heartbeat, the world tilted in a blur of falling dust and broken planks. Then Max's jaws gripped the sleeve of Jake's coat. The dog planted his paws wide and pulled with powerful force. Jake felt the weight of his body straining downward into the dark space of the basement. But Max held on. Jake braced himself and pushed upward with his free arm. Max continued pulling until Jake managed to hook his elbow onto a solid beam. With one final surge of effort, Jake lifted himself out of the collapsing section of floor and rolled onto safer ground. He lay still for a moment, breathing heavily, feeling the cold air burn through his lungs. Max stood over him with tense posture, his amber eyes wide with concern. Jake reached up and rested a hand on the dog's neck. Gratitude moved through him in a slow, heavy wave. The fracture in the floor was not a simple accident. The break was too deliberate. The weakened boards had been cut from below. Someone had intended for the floor to give way under weight. When his breath steadied, Jake crawled closer to examine the broken area. The edges showed recent tool marks, clean slices that did not match natural decay. Whoever had done this knew how to conceal damage long enough to make it seem accidental. Jake felt anger stir beneath his calm surface. He did not allow himself to speak aloud, but the truth was clear. Someone wanted to injure anyone who entered this workshop, and if Howard had been the target, it meant one thing. There were people who wanted this building destroyed, along with any evidence tied to Howard's ownership. Jake rose to his feet slowly. The old instincts from his years of service settled over him like a controlled flame. He felt no panic, only a sharpening awareness. He moved with greater care now. Max guided him toward the back corner of the workshop. The dog sniffed along the wall and paused at a narrow gap between planks. Jake moved closer and noticed fresh footprints near the area, prints made by larger boots than his. The tracks led toward the rear exit that was now partially buried under snow. Jake followed the faint impressions outside. The air felt different here, heavy with a quiet hostility. The ground had been disturbed by more than one set of boots. Jake examined the pattern and saw that the tracks led toward the tree line. They did not return. Whoever had been here had left during the storm. He wondered how many people had been involved, but Max's earlier reactions told him it was more than one, a small group, organized enough to work together, and clearly motivated by something tied to Howard's land. Jake felt his mind settle on a grim realization. A group wanted to take Howard's property. They had come to the workshop to erase proof that the old man still had rightful claim to it. They had damaged the interior and had been present when Howard arrived. The old man's fear now made sense. He had run from someone. His collapse in the barn was no coincidence. He had been escaping danger when the storm overtook him. Jake let out a long breath and watched it fade into the cold air. His thoughts circled steadily as he assessed the situation. Howard was vulnerable and confused. Someone wanted what he possessed, and Jake had stumbled directly into the path of that conflict. But he did not hesitate. He had rescued too many people during his years in service to ever turn away now. The instinct to protect had been shaped in him long ago. It lived in him as surely as his heartbeat. Max nudged his hand with a low sound, urging him to return to the cabin. They needed to check on Howard. They needed to decide what to do next. Jake nodded and placed a firm hand on Max's back. Together, they began the walk home through the cold, quiet morning, leaving the wounded workshop behind them. As they moved across the snowy ground, Jake felt a new sense of purpose settle into his steps. He did not know who the intruders were or why they wanted Howard's land. But he had seen enough to understand that the danger was real, and he knew he and Max would face it. The cold breeze brushed against his face as he walked, carrying the faint echo of the workshop's broken silence. Jake pushed forward with steady resolve. He had saved Howard once. Now he would uncover the truth behind the men lurking in the shadows. For now, he held to one simple fact. He would not let anyone take what belonged to Howard, not while he and Max still stood. The afternoon settled over the mountain town with a muted glow as pale sunlight drifted through thinning clouds. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind cold air that carried the scent of damp soil and melted frost. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with lingering moisture, and the ground near the workshop felt softer underfoot as Jake and Max walked toward the damaged building once again. The earlier danger had not faded from Jake's mind, but the pressing need to understand what Howard had tried to protect pushed him forward with steady purpose. Jake approached the workshop door with caution, his steps measured and controlled. Max moved ahead, nose lowered, reading every trace of scent along the entrance. The dog's posture remained alert but calm, as if he recognized the threat from earlier, yet sensed no immediate intrusion now. Inside, the workshop remained unchanged from their previous visit. Broken boards lay scattered across the floor. Dust drifted lazily in the faint light, and the cracked area where Jake had nearly fallen still yawned open with dark, cold emptiness. Jake knelt beside the hole and studied the shadows below. The soft smell of old tools and soil drifted upward. Max suddenly leaned forward, sniffing the air more intensely. His ears pricked, and he shifted his weight toward the darkness beneath the broken boards. Jake recognized the signal. Max had found something worth investigating. Jake lowered himself carefully onto the remaining stable beams and climbed down into the cramped basement space. The earth beneath the workshop felt cool and damp. The dim light revealed old shelves lined with rusted items, splintered crates, and wooden fragments that had once been part of a busy workspace. Max descended behind him, moving with confident agility despite the uneven ground. The dog padded slowly to the far corner, where loose dirt and broken timber formed a small mound. He lowered his head and sniffed deeply, then began digging with deliberate strokes of his paws. Jake crouched beside him. The soil gave way easily, revealing the worn outline of a small wooden box. It was rectangular, with darkened edges, sealed by strips of aged wax that had grown brittle with time. Jake felt a quiet shift inside himself as he lifted the box free. Whatever lay inside had been hidden with care and intention. Jake carried the box toward a patch of faint light bleeding through the floor's broken planks. Max sat close, watching with focused calm. Jake brushed away the loose dirt and slid his fingers along the lid. The wax seal cracked gently under his pressure. When he opened the box, the scent of old paper and cedar drifted upward. Inside lay several folded sheets, yellowed softly by age, but still intact. Jake lifted the top set of papers. They were detailed woodworking designs drawn with steady lines and precise measurements. Each one carried the name of Howard's son in careful handwriting. The drawings showed furniture pieces, support beams, and outlines of a workshop expansion. It was clear these were not just designs, but dreams laid carefully onto paper. Beneath the designs, Jake found another stack of documents. These pages carried a heavier tone. They were legal forms and personal letters, written in the same familiar hand. The most striking item was a formal will left by Howard's son. Jake unfolded it slowly. The will stated clearly that the workshop would remain under Howard Miller's rightful ownership. It also affirmed the original purpose the shop had served. Howard and his son had dedicated the space to teaching carpentry skills to veterans returning home from service, providing them with free instruction, tools, and a place to rebuild their lives. Jake felt the words settle into him with quiet force. The workshop had not only been a business, it had been a sanctuary for men like him, a place meant to offer purpose to those who carried invisible wounds. Jake climbed out of the basement with the box in his arms. Max followed close behind, brushing dust from his coat as he stepped into the open space of the workshop. The weight of the box felt heavier now, not physically, but emotionally. Jake understood what these documents meant. They proved Howard's rightful claim to the land and revealed the heart of the workshop's history. They also explained the depth of the old man's grief. His son's legacy had been locked away here, hidden beneath years of dust and fear. Jake returned to the cabin with Max at his side. Howard sat where Jake had left him, wrapped in blankets with his posture slightly stronger than the day before. His face still held exhaustion, but his eyes carried a flicker of attention. Jake placed the wooden box beside him and opened it so that Howard could see the contents. For a moment, Howard did not speak. His breath caught in his throat, and his fingers trembled as he reached for the first sheet. His eyes moved across the designs, tracing each line with the weight of someone rediscovering a piece of himself. Tears gathered slowly at the edges of his eyes. His chest rose and fell unevenly as he lifted the will left by his son. Howard pressed the paper against his chest. His expression shifted from sorrow to something deeper and more fragile. The memories of his son seemed to flood through him. The workshop had once been alive with their shared effort. Now the discovery of these documents returned a part of that life to him. Silent tears ran down his weathered cheeks, and he shook with quiet emotion. Jake watched him with a steady, soft gaze. He felt the depth of Howard's pain, but also sensed a small spark of healing beginning to rise. The workshop had not died with Howard's son. It had waited patiently for this moment. Jake spoke calmly and clearly. He explained that he would help Howard restore the workshop. He would repair the broken floors and clear the dust. He would bring the building back to life so that Howard could reclaim what had been taken from him. A slow, fragile hope filled the old man's expression. His voice cracked with gratitude and grief. Jake felt something shift inside himself, too. He understood the importance of serving a purpose greater than his own survival. The workshop had once helped men like him. Now he would give back by rebuilding it for those who might need it again. Max lay down beside Howard's cot and rested his head on the old man's knee. His calm presence anchored the moment. The dog sensed the weight of the discovery and offered comfort in his silent, loyal way. Howard placed a trembling hand on Max's fur and let out a long breath that seemed to release years of sorrow. The heart of the workshop had been found again, and with it, the first step toward restoring everything it had meant to the town and to the people who once found shelter there. Winter pressed down on the mountain town with heavy silence. Snow drifted in slow, steady sheets across the valley, and the wind carried a sharp, dry cold that stung the skin with every breath. The sky held a pale gray color that made the world feel distant and muted, as if everything beneath it had been carved from frost. Through this still landscape, Jake walked with Max at his side, each step sinking lightly into the fresh layer of snow as they made their way toward the workshop. Jake had barely slept the night before. The discovery of the documents had given Howard new hope, and that hope had rooted itself inside Jake too. He felt a sense of responsibility building inside him, something both familiar and heavy. It reminded him of the feeling he used to carry in the field, the sense that others looked to him when conditions turned harsh. He had tried to bury that part of himself after the war, but now it seemed to rise again with quiet insistence. He knew he could not rebuild the workshop alone. His body carried scars from old injuries and endless years of labor. The work ahead would take strength and precision. It would take hands that understood tools and weather and grit. So he sought out the men in town who shared his past, men who had returned from service and slipped into silence. Some struggled with work. Some struggled with loneliness. Some simply drifted from day to day. If the workshop had once taught skills to veterans, then perhaps it could do so again. And if they rebuilt it together, maybe they could rebuild parts of themselves as well. Jake gathered 4 men by midday. The first was Mark Turner, a burly man in his early 50s, with a thick beard streaked with gray and deep lines across his forehead. His broad shoulders spoke of years of physical labor, but the sag in his posture revealed exhaustion from long stretches of unemployment. His voice carried a low rasp from too many winters spent outdoors. Mark kept to himself around town, but Jake had known him from volunteer shifts and had seen glimpses of quiet patience beneath his rough appearance. The second man was Daniel Reyes, a lean, sharp-faced veteran in his late 30s. His hair was cropped close, and his dark eyes held a guarded look. He had once been a skilled mechanic, but after losing work, he had begun to drift. Daniel moved with controlled precision, but rarely spoke unless necessary. There was an air of tension around him, as if he remained half-anchored in memories he did not speak about. The third was Sam Collins, a younger veteran in his late 20s, with sandy blonde hair and strong arms built from years of lifting lumber. Sam had a warm face, with freckles across his nose, and a hopeful quality despite the challenges he faced. He struggled to find steady work, but carried a natural determination, and often tried to lift the spirits of others, even when he felt uncertain inside. Jake saw potential in him, and believed that the workshop could offer the young man purpose. The fourth was Henry Brooks, a slender and quiet man in his mid-40s with thinning brown hair and pale skin. Henry had a thoughtful nature and a habit of observing more than he spoke. He once worked in carpentry, but had withdrawn from the trade after an accident left him shaken. Jake approached him carefully, knowing Henry carried old fears, but the man agreed to join after seeing Jake's calm, steady resolve and the loyal watchfulness of Max. The group gathered at the entrance of the workshop as snow continued to fall. Their breath formed soft clouds in the frigid air. None of them spoke at first. They simply looked at the damaged building and then at Jake. Responsibility settled across Jake's shoulders, but he felt Max at his side, a silent anchor grounding him. The German shepherd sat upright with a poised and steady posture. His coat of black and tan fur caught the muted daylight, and his amber eyes scanned the surroundings with sharp awareness. Max appeared calm, but alert, ready to guide and ready to protect. Jake began outlining the work that needed to be done. The floorboards had to be replaced. The walls needed reinforcement. Tools needed cleaning and storage racks needed repair. As Jake spoke, he felt a sense of purpose tightening inside him. These men needed structure, they needed direction, and he felt capable of giving it. The work began slowly. The cold made their fingers stiff, and the constant fall of snow slowed progress. Mark used his strength to lift heavy boards, while Daniel checked each support beam with meticulous attention. Sam cleared debris, and Henry measured and cut replacement planks. Jake moved among them, offering guidance or lending his strength whenever needed. Through it all, Max watched every corner of the room. He moved between the workers as if checking on their safety, nudging a hand here or pacing near weak flooring there. His presence settled the group in ways Jake could witness, but not fully explain. By midday, the group had established a rhythm. The repeated sounds of sawing and hammering filled the workshop with steady energy. For the first time in years, the building felt alive again. Snow continued to gather outside, but inside warmth formed through shared effort. Mark muttered occasional comments that drew faint smiles from Sam. Daniel found a steady focus in the precise work of reinforcing beams. Henry breathed more evenly as he handled tools he once feared, gradually remembering the skill that lay dormant within him. Despite the progress, Max remained alert. At one point, he froze near a side wall, his ears rising sharply. Jake approached him quietly and scanned the perimeter. The wind pressed against the windows, producing fleeting shadows that flickered across the snow. Jake stepped outside. He saw nothing, but sensed that someone had been near. He looked at Max, who lowered his head, but remained tense. The memory of the earlier sabotage reminded Jake that the danger had not passed. Someone still wanted to prevent Howard from reclaiming his workshop. Jake returned inside with a sharpened awareness. He strengthened his resolve. The threat would not stop them. If anything, it tightened their unity. Throughout the afternoon, the men pushed through exhaustion, their boots soaked from melting snow. Their breaths grew heavier, but none stepped away. Max continued to weave through the workspace, offering a calming presence that eased the strain. When Henry hesitated at a creaking board, Max nudged him gently, and the man steadied himself. When Sam dropped a tool in frustration, Max placed a paw beside it until the young man exhaled and picked it back up. The dog became more than a companion. He became a quiet guardian of the group's spirit. As evening approached, the sky deepened into a muted blue. Light faded, but the men worked under lanterns Jake had set along the walls. One by one, new boards replaced the broken ones. The foundation strengthened. A sense of pride settled over them. They were not simply repairing a building. They were reclaiming something that had once brought light into the lives of others. Jake looked around the workshop with tired eyes, yet felt a warmth spreading through his chest. The building had begun to breathe again. Howard's legacy had taken its first step toward revival. The men stood amid the dust, and the newly fitted beams sharing a quiet moment of accomplishment. Max sat near Jake, snowflakes melting on his fur, his gaze steady and sure. Jake placed a hand on the dog's back and felt a calm certainty flow into him. The work would continue. The winter would not break them. Together, they would rebuild the heart of the workshop. Night settled over the mountain town in a deep quiet that seemed almost too heavy for the freshly rebuilt workshop. The air was sharp and still. A thin sheet of frost clung to the windows, and the sky carried a cold blue cast that made the surrounding pine trees look darker than usual. The moon was hidden behind drifting clouds, and only a few faint stars flickered through the shifting veil. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the entire valley seemed to hold its breath as the temperature continued to fall. Inside the workshop, Jake and the small group of veterans worked late into the evening. Lanterns glowed softly along the walls. The men moved with tired but steady determination. The repairs were nearly finished, and the old building showed signs of life again. The walls were reinforced. The floorboards were replaced. The cold still crept in through small gaps, but the structure felt strong and ready for its purpose. Jake felt pride in the progress, but also an undercurrent of caution. The earlier sabotage remained fresh in his mind, and he feared the danger had not yet passed. Max lay near the doorway, with his head resting on his paws. His eyes half closed, but his ears stayed sharp and alert. His calm posture belied a readiness to react at the slightest change. The veterans respected the dog deeply. They could sense his awareness and felt safer when he patrolled the edges of the workshop. Jake paused his work to look at Max and felt a quiet reassurance settle in him. The dog had never failed him or anyone else. Outside, the wind picked up. A soft grit of icy snow skimmed across the windows. Jake felt a shift in the air. It was small but distinct. Max sensed it too. His head rose slowly. His body stiffened, and his amber eyes locked on the doorway. Jake froze. The men around him paused their tasks. The workshop became silent, except for the distant sound of wind brushing against the wooden walls. Max stood up, his tail held low, his gaze fixed with intense focus. A deep, low growl rumbled from his chest. Jake felt his heart tighten with recognition. Max only made that sound when danger approached. The dog took several deliberate steps toward the door. His muscles coiled with controlled tension. Jake gestured for the men to stay behind him. The storm of instinct built inside him. He recognized this feeling from distant nights overseas. The knowledge that something was about to break through the stillness. Then Max barked. One sharp, powerful note that echoed through the workshop. Jake moved quickly to the door and stepped outside with Max leading the way. The night was darker now, the clouds heavier, the wind colder. Through the shadows, Jake saw 3 figures near the side of the building. Their shapes hunched, and their movements rushed. They carried tools and metal bars. The same group that had tried to destroy the workshop earlier had returned. Jake felt anger rise in him. Not the explosive kind, but a hard, controlled force. These men were here to erase Howard's legacy and crush the purpose the veterans had worked tirelessly to rebuild. He stepped forward with steady resolve. Max sprinted ahead, circling the intruders with sharp barks that forced them to slow and retreat from the workshop wall. The intruders panicked. They tried to move away, but Max blocked their path. The dog moved with precision and strength. His posture communicated a clear warning without crossing into aggression. Jake approached cautiously, ready for confrontation. Behind him, the veterans stepped outside as well. Mark with his heavy build, Daniel with sharp alert eyes, Sam with quick hands ready to assist, Henry standing with quiet determination. They formed a united line behind Jake. The tension grew as the intruders realized they were outnumbered. Their plan had failed, and Max had dismantled their element of surprise. In the distance, lights flickered between the trees. More figures approached along the snow-covered path. Jake squinted and recognized the residents of the town. People carried lanterns and flashlights. They had come after hearing the noise and after hearing the truth about Howard's ownership and the attempt to destroy his rightful property. The townspeople surrounded the area with firm but calm presence. Among them were shop owners, elders, and neighbors who knew Howard from years past. Their faces carried a mix of anger and protectiveness. They stood together, forming a broad circle around the intruders. The three saboteurs froze. Their expressions shifted from defiance to fear as the weight of the community pressed around them. Jake stepped forward. His voice remained steady and controlled. He stated clearly that the group had returned to destroy property and threaten the safety of the workshop. Several townspeople moved to restrain the intruders, while others contacted the local authorities. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived. They were both strong men with stern faces and thick winter coats. Their presence added gravity to the moment. The officers took statements from the residents, and the veterans then escorted the intruders away through the snow. As the danger passed, the tension softened. The townspeople turned to Jake and the veterans, offering reassurance and gratitude. Their expressions warmed with understanding. The truth about Howard's workshop had opened their hearts. They now rallied to support the restoration. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The workshop would no longer stand alone against hidden threats. It now had the strength of a community behind it. The veterans returned inside with Jake and Max. Together, they looked around the nearly finished space. The lanterns glowed more warmly now. The walls looked sturdier. The air felt brighter. Howard entered the workshop slowly, his frail form wrapped in layers of warm clothing. His eyes widened as he saw the men gathered before him. The repairs neared completion. The heart of his son's legacy was beating again. Jake felt his chest tighten with quiet emotion. The workshop was ready. It would become a place for veterans and young people who needed direction and belonging. Max lay down at the center of the room. His strong, calm presence made the moment feel complete. Jake placed a hand on the dog's back and breathed deeply. They had protected the workshop. The storm had passed, and light had returned. Morning light spread softly across the valley as winter finally loosened its grip. The air carried a gentle coolness, but no longer held the harsh bite of frost. Snow remained only in thin patches that sparkled faintly where the sun touched them. The sky was clear and pale blue with streaks of warm gold rising from the horizon. Birds returned to the treetops with quiet early songs, and the scent of thawing earth drifted through the air as if the land itself breathed again. Spring had begun. Jake stood outside the newly restored workshop, with Max sitting at his heel. The building looked transformed under the soft morning sunlight. Fresh wood beams glowed with a clean, warm tone. The repaired windows reflected the sky. The structure stood solid and welcoming, no longer burdened by silence or decay. Jake felt something shift inside him as he looked at it. A sense of belonging slowly rose through the spaces where old grief had once settled. The transformation of the workshop mirrored a change he had not expected within himself. Howard walked toward Jake with slow, steady steps. Though still thin, he held his posture with more strength now. His gray hair sat neatly combed, and his worn face carried softer lines than before. There was calmness in his eyes, the kind that comes after a long period of sorrow has begun to ease. He wore a simple wool coat with sleeves slightly frayed at the edges. The coat seemed too big for his frame, but he carried himself with a renewed dignity. In his hands, he held a small wooden key and a folded note. Jake watched the old man approach and felt a quiet warmth stir in his chest. Howard reached him and offered the small key with a gentle nod. His hands trembled slightly from age and emotion, but his gaze remained steady. Jake accepted the key and felt the smoothness of the handcrafted handle. Howard motioned toward the workshop with a faint smile. The message was clear, even without words. They entered together. The workshop glowed in the sunlight that slipped through the tall windows. Near the back, a small, freshly built room stood against the wall. The door was new, crafted with careful precision. The grain of the wood flowed in soft patterns, and the hinges gleamed. Jake stepped inside. The space was humble but warm. A bed stood against the corner with a wool blanket folded neatly on top. A small desk sat near the window, where morning light pooled gently across its surface. The room felt complete, like a quiet refuge carved out of hope and gratitude. Jake felt a deep, slow breath move through him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of wandering loosen. The room carried the unmistakable sense of a home offered with love. Howard watched with soft emotion as Jake's eyes moved across the space. The old man's shoulders lowered slightly, as if releasing a burden he had carried too long. Gratitude filled the silence between them. No words were needed. The following days unfolded with gentle steadiness. Jake found a new sense of purpose rising within him. He began teaching woodworking techniques to the veterans who had helped rebuild the shop. Mark, with his strength, learned refined control in cutting precise beams. Daniel found calm in repetitive shaping and sanding. Sam showed eagerness and steady improvement as he practiced new joinery methods. Henry rediscovered confidence through crafting simple pieces that slowly grew more intricate. Jake guided each man with patience and quiet understanding. He recognized their struggles because they reflected pieces of his own past. The workshop gradually filled with sounds of life, the rhythm of saws, the tapping of hammers, the low hum of conversation. The warmth of shared purpose created an atmosphere that steadied every soul within its walls. Youth from the town also visited, curious and eager to learn. Some carried shy smiles and worn jackets. Others carried restless energy. Jake welcomed them all. The work gave them direction and a place to belong. Max thrived in the new environment. The German Shepherd moved calmly between the workstations with steady steps and bright eyes. Younger veterans knelt to stroke his fur during moments of fatigue. Teenagers laughed softly when Max nudged their hands to encourage them to stay focused. The dog seemed to sense emotional weight with uncanny precision. When someone grew tense, he pressed his warm head gently against their leg. When someone struggled with frustration, he rested his paw beside them. Max became the unofficial heart of the center, a presence that soothed without words. As spring deepened, the day of the workshop's reopening approached. The town gathered in growing numbers. News of the restoration had spread. People carried food, handmade gifts, and warm smiles. Decorations were hung around the building in soft colors that matched the season. Gentle laughter echoed through the open doorways as neighbors reunited. On the day of the celebration, sunlight poured through the clouds like a blessing. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and thawed earth. The community filled the workshop yard. Howard stood near the entrance in a clean shirt and carefully combed hair. The veterans stood with him. Jake stood close by, with Max at his side. People approached them with genuine warmth, offering handshakes and embraces. Many remembered Howard's son. Many remembered how the workshop once served those who needed guidance. the celebration held a quiet sense of unity. Elders from the town placed gentle hands on Howard's shoulders. Families gathered around the new workbenches. Children ran in circles with wooden toys crafted by the veterans. Sunlight filled the air with a glow that felt almost symbolic, as though the season itself had chosen to bless the new beginning. Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion that blended relief, pride, and softness. Howard stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice trembled, but remained strong enough for all to hear. He expressed simple gratitude for the men who rebuilt the workshop. His eyes filled with tears when he looked at Jake and Max. The moment felt heavy with meaning. Howard understood that the workshop had been revived not only for him, but for everyone who needed a place of healing. The crowd responded with warm applause. People embraced one another. Some laughed through tears. The sun brightened the yard as clouds drifted aside, revealing a pure spring sky. The entire community felt joined by a shared thread of compassion. Jake placed a hand on Max's head. The dog pressed against his leg with gentle weight. Jake realized then that he was no longer lost. The workshop had given him purpose. Howard had given him family. The veterans had given him companionship. And Max had given him unfailing loyalty. The world around him felt lighter. The grief he once carried felt softened by new meaning. He understood that home was not a place found by chance, but a space built through connection, sacrifice, and trust. As the celebration continued, Jake stood quietly, watching the sunlight dance across the workshop walls. Children's laughter mingled with the steady, calm presence of the veterans. Howard smiled gently as he greeted neighbors. Max lay in the grass with content ease. Jake breathed in the warm spring air and allowed peace to settle deep within him. He and Max had finally found a true home. When the dust finally settled around the workshop and spring softened the world again, the story of Jake, Max, and Howard stood as a gentle reminder of what can rise from broken places. Their journey showed that healing often begins with small acts of courage and the willingness to stand beside someone who has forgotten their own strength. A community found its voice again. Veterans found purpose. A lonely man found home. And through it all, a loyal dog carried a quiet light that guided every troubled heart back toward hope. In moments like these, we remember that God often works through our hands and our compassion. His miracles do not always arrive with noise. Sometimes they unfold in the steady rebuilding of a life or in the warmth of neighbors who refuse to give up on one another. Let this story remind you that hope still lives in every town and every heart willing to believe in it. If this message touched your spirit, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment, join our community, and subscribe for more stories of faith, kindness, and resilience. May God bless you and keep your light shining wherever you are today.